So, recapitulating what we have said before, which are the main themes that Emily Dickinson discusses in her poetry? Her themes are death, love, God, nature, paradise, religion, eternity, pain. But it's not, as I said before, what is important is not only the theme, but the way that she discusses the theme and the very controversial perspective that sometimes she adopts about them. Other themes: the soul, prayer, the heart, heaven, life, and poetry. And what is the tone of her poetry? Sometimes she can be very witty, or very ironical, very polemical or controversial, and many times she says things which were totally and completely unacceptable for her own times. But what is interesting is that her poetry is what we call a poetry of rapture, or a poetry of heuristic quest. What does it mean, heuristic quest? Through her poetry, what she was doing was looking for knowledge, or searching for knowledge. You understand? It is as if each poem was a kind of epistemological system. And through each one of her poems, she would put, for example, one theme, one conflict, one issue that was concerning her. She would analyze that issue, and many times she would come to a conclusion or not. Many times she would write more than one poem on the same subject. Okay, so she would take one subject, for example, religion, and then she would approach it from one perspective, and then she would approach exactly the same subject from a different perspective. And she would put both poems in counterpoint. So this is why it is said that many times her poems are like different facets of the same jewel. So one might say that all her poetry was like a big jewel, and each one of these small poems would make up a facet of it. Just for you to see how she can have different approaches to the same topic, we are going to read parts of two poems on the same subject, the subject of prayer. So this is the stanza from poem 502. She begins saying, "At least to pray is left. O Jesus, in the air, I know not which thy chamber is, I'm knocking everywhere." So she's talking in this case of prayer as if it were one of the few elements that people have, humanity has, in order to approach God, so that in a moment of despair, one would be able to get to God through it. So this is why she begins saying, at least. You know, prayer is one of the few things that we are left with. And then she calls Jesus, and she says, "Oh Jesus, in the air," and in a very beautiful manner, in order to show that she has been calling Jesus, she has been trying to communicate to Jesus, but apparently she cannot hear his voice. She says, "I know not which thy chamber is." It is as if she had been trying different prayers, different forms of discourse in order to approach God, and she makes an analogy between these different forms of prayers and the chambers in a house. And she says, "I'm knocking everywhere," as if every time she said a prayer, she would be knocking on a door, expecting Jesus to answer. But you can see that in this way, it is a way of worshiping God, of saying that the only thing that can save her is precisely to be able to communicate with God. But then, look at what happens in poem 437. She says, this is a very complex poem, very critical, and sometimes very opaque to understand. Prayer is the little implement through which men reach where presence is denied them. They fling their speech by means of it in God's ear. If then he hear, these sum the apparatus comprised in prayer. So she's in this case drawing an analogy in a very disrespectful manner between a prayer and some sort of mechanical device that she calls an implement. And she says that through this implement, men can reach where presence is denied them. That is to say, we are denied the presence of God. Okay? And then they say that what they do through this implement or through this prayer is to throw into God's ear what they are trying to say. And very disrespectfully, she says, if then he hear, meaning if God hears, if God makes us the favor of listening to our prayers, okay, to what we are demanding, okay, so if he hears, if he decides to pay attention to us, okay, then this little implement has really become a prayer. So you can see the different tone between one poem and the second. In one she's worshiping God, and in the other she's talking about prayer, okay, that should be holy, okay, a holy way of approaching God in a very disrespectful manner. But what is interesting, that while she was doing this, or while she was writing these very beautiful poems, she was doing what? She was questioning her own beliefs. When she was showing that you can approach the same theme from two different perspectives, as the two poems on prayer show, what she was trying to show is that there is no universal or permanent truth. Now, for a woman in the 19th century to state such a thing, that truth is not universal and that it can be understood in very different ways, it was really a rupture. It was really marking your own difference. It was really entering a field that was reserved to men, that was the world of intellect. As you know, for women was reserved the world of feelings, of sentiments, the home, and for men the public life and the life of intellect. And what Emily Dickinson was doing, writing these wonderful poems in the kitchen of her house, was in a way entering, okay, in a very surreptitious manner into men's intellectual life. So this is why we say that the poems are like an epistemological system, a system of knowledge, because through this poem she's questioning her own beliefs, okay? She's questioning her own ideas. And this is why also we call this form of poetry heuristic poetry. And I don't know if you have noticed the syntax, that many times the syntax is inverted and many times all the verses are broken. So you have seen that there are a number of dashes, okay? Those dashes, she starts a verse, dash, stops, then she continues, then another dash, and so on and so forth. In fact, what they are showing are the different moments, okay, of the process of the working of her mind. It is as if at the moment she is writing, she were building the thought. And what marks the process of creation or the building of the thoughts is precisely the use of dashes. And what is interesting is that when she was looking for knowledge, what she was also doing was trying to imagine or to propose a better world. So, just to recapitulate what I have just said, some of the marks of this heuristic poetry, or this poetry that looks the search for knowledge, would be the use of dashes, the inverted syntax. Many times she instead of starting the verse or the line with the subject, she would start with the object, okay? And also, many of the poems, they have an open ending. I don't know if you have noticed, and if not, then you go back on the poems we have read and analyzed. You will see that many of the poems, instead of finishing with the final dot, they finish with a dash. That dash that the poem has at the end precisely shows that her discussion of the theme has not finished, and that she can take up exactly the same subject in another poem and discuss it from a different perspective. So if you come to think of her poetry sometimes has more elements of modernism than elements of romanticism. But of course, this is also typical of an American poet. America was a new country, the country of democracy, the country of difference, and even this woman, in her secluded life and with her poetry, she was in a way expressing this great ideology that was pervading the whole of the United States. Not that she was accepting everything, many times she was criticizing everything, but she was in her own way part of this major ideology. So, just to show you how she works with this idea of the poem as a system of knowledge or as a system or as an epistemology, we are going to work a little bit on poem 657. We can say that this poem is a meta-literary poem. What is a meta-literary poem or a meta-literary novel or a meta-literary reference in a literary text? It is a reference to the act of writing. It is a reference to the act of composing literature. So she says, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. So she starts in the first verse with this idea, I dwell in possibility. What is the meaning of the verb to dwell? To dwell means to live. And instead of saying, I live in a house or I dwell in a house, she says that she lives in possibility. So she lives in some realm, in some space, okay, that gives her, that provides her with the possibility of understanding life from different perspectives. And then she says, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. And immediately she is establishing a comparison between this word possibility and this word prose. So we can see that if she is comparing possibility to prose, possibility should stand for poetry, okay? So what she's saying is that the genre of poetry gives her many possibilities to think, to reflect, than the genre of prose. And what is interesting is that in order to compare poetry to prose, she's using this metaphor of the house, okay? So you see that through the word dwell, living, and also through the word house. And then she would continue with the same metaphor when in the next verse she says, more numerous of windows, superior of doors. So it means that poetry is open. Poetry allows you to spread your wings. Poetry allows you to think, okay? And this is conveyed through this idea of a house with many windows, many doors, a very open house. And then she says, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for everlasting roof, the gambrels of the skies. So she says that in this house there are chambers which are like woods of cedars, and it is impregnable of eye. It means that the eye can see beyond. And this is an idea that she takes from the romantic poets, the transcendental poets in America, that they had this experience of meeting God, of facing God, when they were in contact with nature. So she says the same happens here in this house of poetry, that it allows you to see beyond. The romantic poets in England, they say that the poet had like a third eye here on the forehead, and it was with this third eye that you could transcend the material world into the spiritual world and connect with God. And then she goes on with this analogy of the house to say, and for everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. So this house of poetry has no limit, or we can say that the limit is the sky. And then she goes on, of visitors the fairest, of for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. So who enters this wonderful, beautiful house of poetry? The different topics, the different images, the different elements that she wants to enter or that she wants to reflect upon. So they are the fairest. Fairest means the best. Those ones she wants to deal with, those ones she wants to associate with. And what is the occupation that the people have in this house of possibility or this house of poetry? To spread wide her narrow hands. So she understands when she says that she has narrow hands, that as a human being she is limited. But what is interesting is that although her hands are limited, poetry allows her to stretch them very far. Do you see what a beautiful contrast she is establishing between her own possibilities, her own limitations, and all the scope that poetry offers to the poem. And she says, and this is the most beautiful line, that it is precisely through this act of composing poetry that she can gather paradise. So meaning, she is approaching God, finally she is getting to God, not through prayer, but through poetry. Or what we could say is that in her views or in her world, okay, this poetry has the same value of prayer. Isn't it beautiful? So once again, you see that she brings into her poetry this element of paradise, this element of God. Just to finish this section of our class, I want to once again to go back and see what she's saying in the different poems, and you will see how they are all connected. The poems about prayer, and in this case, the poem about poetry. And you will see that both poems on prayer and on poetry, in a way, they have many elements in common. But once again, she's reaffirming what she says in that first poem we read, that first comes the poet, then the sun, and then God. In this case, we would say that first comes poetry, and then comes praying. Or in different words, that actually when she's writing poetry, what she's doing is praying, and in this moment, as she says at the end of the poem, she can reach the ear of God. So we go now to the break. So as I said before, try to recapitulate and reorganize everything we have said, and then we move on to the next part of the class.